we will be moving to West Africa as well, with some contributions from different countries, including Cameroon, including Djibouti, and a few others, and some debates with some of our African peace activist colleagues. But I think now our tech is officially up and running. So I think we can officially bring the Peace Wave to its start. And please tune in anytime that you're able to do so over the next 24-hour period. We will be online, or our colleagues will be online during this entire period. So without any further ado, maybe briefly, just for those that may be not too familiar with World Beyond War or the International Peace Bureau, World Beyond War is an international organization for peace focused on abolishing war and delegitimizing war as a tool to resolve issues and to promote a just and sustainable peace. Their central office is in the US, but they also have dozens of chapters and nearly 100 affiliates around the world. The International Peace Bureau is one of the world's oldest and largest international peace networks, founded in 1891. And Nobel Peace Laureate from 1910. We are a network of over 400 organizational members and 1,000 individual members from all around the world, coordinating actions to create a world without war and also a just peace. So we're very happy to work together with World Beyond War and to bring our activists together for these important discussions, debates, and actions over these next 24 hours. So with all of that in mind, we would also ask you, if you're interested in donating to support the 24-hour Peace Wave and some of our work, including, most importantly, for the donations funding the upcoming NATO Counter Summit in Washington, D.C. We will post a link into the chat as well as on the streaming platforms. And we would much appreciate any support that you would be able to give so that we can take these 24 hours of action and bring them to Washington, D.C. and demand our voices be heard for peace. So our first section, we are going to start then in the UK. And here we have an introduction video from Sophie Bolt, the Vice Chair of CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in the UK, who will introduce a couple further videos that they have made from UK. Please bear with us. We are again having just a few technical issues. We promise these issues will quickly be resolved. Here we go. We have, oh no, I think that's just the screen for now coming up, but we'll have video playing quite shortly here. We have tested this all in advance, but as we all know with these live long Zoom calls, sometimes things take a little bit of time just to make sure that we get them right for you. So in just 1 second, we'll be able to share that video from Sophie Bolt. You have to stop sharing.
Okay.
No, mute yourself, mute yourself.
Hello, everybody. I'm really sorry not to be with you today. So I'm Sophie Bolton. I'm one of the vice chairs of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. A massive thanks to the International Peace Bureau and the World Beyond War for organising this amazing 24-hour peace wave ahead of the NATO summit in New York. So as part of the NATO's massive nuclear expansion across Europe, the US plans to site its nuclear weapons at the RAF base in Lakenheath. And those plans have become much more public. The evidence is now overwhelming that the US plans to bring B-6112 bombs here. We had a huge amount of media coverage back in January, which came on the heels of the British Defence Secretary's speech about defending Britain from a more dangerous world. And in it, he talked about moving from a post-war to a pre-war situation where Britain needs to gear up for waging war against Russia, China, Iran, the Yemen, basically everywhere. And so the NATO expansion plans for Lakenheath started to be framed as part of this huge push for increased military spending, talks around conscription to defend, weak Britain. I mean, we know, of course, this is absolute rubbish. The UK has the fourth biggest military spending in the world. It's increasing its nuclear arsenal by 40%, and it's actually, playing a really, really aggressive role in making the world far more dangerous. But with this heightened media coverage, we've seen like a greater interest in what's going on at Lakenheath. And CND was approached by the BBC, Britain's state broadcaster, who were producing a documentary about these new nuclear dangers. And so we've included an excerpt from that documentary for you today, which focuses on Lakenheath. So I hope you enjoy that. And since then, our mobilizations at the base have really intensified. We've had like citizens' weapons inspections, lots of sort of action there. And now there's plans for a march and a peace camp taking place at the base from the 13th to the 25th of July, and that's organised by the Lakenheath Alliance for Peace. And you'll find details of that in the chat. So if you can get along, that'd be completely amazing. We're right in the middle of a general election now, and CND is mobilising its supporters to lobby candidates to vote for peace. Make sure your vote counts. And we're calling on our supporters to make candidates pledge their opposition to the return of nuclear weapons to Lakenheath. Then the second video is about the AUKUS Treaty, which obviously Britain is a key player in that. Australia is now signed, procurement agreements. So nearly £4 billion is going to British Aerospace to build nuclear reactors for these new submarines. Now, whilst these submarines won't be ready to be deployed until the 2040s, all the rhetoric around this treaty is driving a new Cold War, which threatens a nuclear confrontation between the US and China. And at the heart of this treaty is nuclear proliferation, with the US and Britain sharing nuclear technology with Australia. So this second video, it's CND sort of spoken to two leading campaigners who are speaking out against the treaty, basically to get their take on why the treaty is so problematic and why it needs to be stopped. So I really hope that you enjoy the films. Thanks again to the International Peace Bureau and World Beyond War. And as I say, I'm really sorry that I'm not able to be with you here today. So thank you and take care.
So thank you to Sophie, as she had written there, or spoken there rather. Given the upcoming UK election, it's a very important time for peace activists in the UK to really be campaigning for alternatives, as we've seen, to the UK's policies. So we'll move right along to the first video, which we mentioned there, which is CND on the BBC's Nuclear Armageddon. How close are we?
Since 2008, there have been no American nuclear weapons in the UK. But that may be coming to an end. Pentagon budget documents suggest the UK will now be one of 6 NATO countries where US special weapons will be stationed. It could well be here, RAF Lakenheath in Suffolk. US fighter planes that will be capable of dropping such weapons are already based here. And there are now plans by the US Air Force to increase accommodation for a potential nuclear mission. It's small scale so far, but there's protest here by the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament.
Sophie, hi, I'm Jane from the
Hi, I've
BBC.
got cold hands.
No wonder being up there. What's the
Yeah.
idea of today? What's this about?
This is all about putting the spotlight on Laken Heath. We've got overwhelming evidence that the US are planning to site nuclear bombs here. The government will neither confirm nor deny, but it's absolutely clear. And we know that we've got public opinion on our side. You know, nearly 60% of the population do not want to have US nuclear bombs sited in Britain. This base is surrounded by secrecy. They don't want people to know what's going on, because people do know. They're up in arms about it.
I'm here protesting today because people need to know about the threat of nuclear weapons being stored at this site or anywhere, really.
So tell me about the 80s. Were you at Greenham Common?
We were part of a women-only demonstration, and we came from all over the country. Women who were just desperate to get rid of these terrible weapons that were going to be put on our soil. That's why I can't believe we're doing this again.
We shouldn't have weapons of mass destruction anywhere in the world, but when they're on your turf, it's extra incumbent on you to do something about it.
We've got nothing to do with this base. It's totally under United States control. If we get Trump in there next time, and he may press the button because he's got a bigger button than Putin, then we are a target.
The British government and the American government would say we need this because Putin has threatened to use nuclear weapons in the context of the invasion of Ukraine.
The idea that like everybody has to nuke up, it's false. It's not working. Do you know what I mean? If you look at it, like, nuclear weapons haven't kept the peace. We're now in this very, very dangerous situation where, you know, the doomsday clock, the atomic scientists who put that together, they're now saying the world is in a far more dangerous situation precisely because of what's happening in Ukraine. So we feel that, like, just adding more nuclear bombs to that situation is not going to make it safer. So that's why we're going to continue protesting here, because we don't want these nuclear weapons coming here. We want to encourage our government to say, nope, we're not going to accept them.
So thank you to Sophie for the amazing video there, and seeing that we are getting media coverage for this very concerning development of US nuclear weapons returning to the UK and to Lakenheath. It's extremely concerning that this is happening, but we're very encouraged by our activists who are there on the ground combating this, and combating it also in the public opinion in the UK at this essential moment. We have one more video then coming from CND. This one is why AUKUS drives nuclear proliferation and a new Cold War. And I think we're ready to show this one, so we'll go right into it.
If you want a very potent submarine reactor, as the British and the Americans utilize, you can use enrichment up to 95% uranium-235, which is basically fully capable of being used directly for nuclear weapons. What this means is that if Australia is going to have these submarines with this grade of uranium, then they're going to be basically importing it at that sort of level or setting up their entire own plant. That's a proliferation risk because it's a spread of more knowledge and technology, and it's one that the International Atomic Energy Agency will be looking at extremely closely.
Sounds dry. it's really designed to be the tip of the spear of Washington's military escalation against China. We know that neither the UK nor Australia are major military powers on a global level. They're positioning themselves to be the junior partners of the United States in this context. This apparently is your Prime Minister's version of what global Britain is supposed to look like. It's supposed to look like being Washington's junior partner in going up against China, in new provocations against China. And this is very, very dangerous. The US is potentially provoking a war. It doesn't mean that there will be a war. It doesn't mean that there will necessarily even be clashes. And if there are clashes, it doesn't necessarily mean it will escalate to the question of a nuclear exchange. But all of that is far more possible now. We should also keep in mind that on the lower level of conflict that could escalate, unlike the situation, say, in Syria and elsewhere, where the US and Russia have maintained military-to-military hotlines where they can notify the other if there's a glitch, if imagine in the very crowded areas around the South China Sea, a young sailor on either side sees a flare perhaps and thinks, oh my God, we're under attack, I better respond. There can be a quick military-to-military phone call, essentially, to say, hold it, that wasn't deliberate, it was a mistake, we're pulling back, don't respond. Right now, the US and China don't have anything like that. So any small exchange could escalate in a very, very dangerous way.
So thank you to Sophie, as well as the speakers in the video there, explaining just exactly why AUKUS, and particularly this agreement and the nuclear submarines that would be included within it, represent a grave danger and threat to peace, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, but also, of course, globally. So one more time, thank you to CND for this. Just for those that are joining late, again, a welcome to the 24-hour Peace Wave. Of course, we still have 23 and a half hours left here, so you're here with plenty of time. And we appreciate everyone who's joining. Keep in mind, if you'd like to, you're free to write in the chat throughout and share some of your comments, or also speak with one another through the chat. We will have some time for Q&A later for the speakers that are with us in person. But for now, we will move from the UK to its next door neighbor, Ireland. And here we have two speakers, Niamh Ní Bhraithín and Edward Horgan, who are joining us live for the event today. Of course, Ireland is a neutral country, which makes it an exception to most of Europe, and one that has played a productive and more peaceful role in many cases, although there are also threats to this neutrality that I think they'll speak about. And both Niamh and Edward were present at a International Neutrality Congress that was held in Bogota, Colombia this past April. So I believe they'll also bring in some comments of that Congress, how things went, and the importance of neutrality towards peace. So Niamh and Ed?
Yeah.
I'll give the floor over to you, please.
Thanks very much, Sean. I think I'm going to go first, and then Ed will probably come in afterwards. But yeah, so thanks a million, Sean and Emily and everyone at IPB and also World Beyond War for inviting me to participate. My name is Niamh Ní Bhraithín. I'm from Ireland. I work at the Transnational Institute, and we do lots of research looking at the structural drivers of war, paying particular attention to the arms trade and the role of arms companies and for-profit kind of motives behind pushing an ever more militarized war and world, focusing particularly on the European Union. And I'll come back to that in a second, because I think the first thing I was going to speak about is actually the Neutrality Congress in Colombia. I suppose I want to mention this first because after seeing the videos on the nuclear buildup that's happening likely to happen in Britain, how terrifying a moment that we are living through, and how urgent and necessary it is that we do everything we can to challenge that moment. And I think that the gathering that we had in Colombia was very important in showing that there are alternatives, and we don't have to continue barreling down the road of war, which is what's happening. So I'll speak just for a few minutes on the Colombia Congress. I'm sure people will join later on in the day from Colombia, but I'm not sure if everyone who's here now, because of the time difference, will be on that the call later in the day. So maybe just for people who didn't know about the Congress or might not have been able to join, we had a Congress in Colombia in April, and the theme of the Congress was that we would gather people from around the world. I think there were over 20 countries represented. And I think there were over 100 delegates between people online and people in person in Colombia. And the idea was that we would come together and talk about neutrality. And there was some skepticism about the idea of neutrality, particularly in Colombia, because of the Colombian relationship with the concept of neutrality around the Unión Patriótica, the Patriotic Union, and the genocide that was perpetrated against them during the Uribe government. But so there was some skepticism about the word neutrality, but once you actually tease it out and explain what it is and really get into the nitty-gritty of neutrality as a very active concept, so it's not something where you stand back and say, well, we're just going to put our hands up and do nothing. That neutrality is an active stance, and you actually need to do an awful lot to stay neutral in the face of a war. Then there was the idea that, well, maybe neutrality is an apolitical stance, but in fact, stepping outside a war and saying we're not going to actively participate in this, we're going to promote ourselves as a state that can hold peace talks, that can mediate, that is inherently a political stance. So there was a lot of discussion in the Congress in neutrality in Colombia on what neutrality could look like in different shapes and forms. One of the most local level kind of examples of neutrality that was given in Colombia was how the peace community in San Jose de Apartadó had declared itself a neutral space. So the community is located in the mountains in the north of Colombia, and how they had declared that in their community they would not allow any armed groups to enter into their community space, and that they were able to carve out within international humanitarian law a space where they could promote peace and neutrality while all of these armed forces were actually waging war around them. So that was a very concrete example in Colombia of how the communities themselves actually came together to build their own kind of bottom-up model of neutrality. And then we also had examples of top-down neutrality, where a state declares itself neutral. We had a very interesting example from Mongolia. I think it's probably the middle of the night now, so I don't think there's anyone on here from Mongolia, but if they are, maybe they'll come in afterwards. But yeah, a very interesting example of neutrality in Mongolia, where geographically it's situated between Russia and China. And the only way it has maintained its neutrality and its peaceful status at the moment is by declaring itself neutral in the face of any aggression between China and Russia. We also had another example from Australia, which links back again to the AUKUS agreement, where the vast majority of people in Australia want Australia to actually declare itself neutral in the face of an impending conflict between the US and China, where Australia, under the AUKUS agreement, would most likely be dragged into that on the side of the US, and the vast majority of the Australian public saying, we want nothing to do with this. We also had examples of the role that Cuba took in hosting the peace negotiations in Colombia, the role that Venezuela had in first off bringing representatives from the Colombian state and from the FARC guerrillas together to initiate those peace negotiations, and a recognition that you have to negotiate to build peace. Peace is not going to come about miraculously. You have to sit down and talk to people that you don't necessarily agree with. And we know that in Ireland, where we had a peace process, where partners or parties who had been at war for years, for decades, for centuries, came together and sat down and discussed how they could build peace. So I mentioned the Congress in Colombia because it was a really important moment. I think it was also important that we went there and we supported Petro's government, because Petro's government is really taking a stance on peace that we need. He's really being a very important voice in calling out what's happening in Palestine, the Israeli genocide in Gaza. And he's been the language that he's using has been really accurate and necessary to frame what Israel is doing in Gaza as a genocide. He is, of course, being attacked by the media, as often peace voices are. We had that in Ireland in the last few weeks, where most people here will know who Claire Daly is, and a member of the European Parliament who stood for re-election. She wasn't re-elected, along with Mick Wallace, also another peace activist for years. And they were really torn apart in the media and framed as being pro-Russian Putin puppets. And many other slanderous titles that were rolled out in the media, really to destroy their chances of re-election. So we see the same kind of pattern happening against peace voices here in Europe, as we do with Petro, for example, in Colombia. And that raises huge questions, and I'm sure we'll get into that, about the role of the media. Especially in the face of what we see, and we know that when we do actually do, polls on where people stand on neutrality and peace, the vast majority will say they support peace, they support neutrality, and they don't want to go to war. So I think there's a lot of questions to be asked about neutrality and the role of the media in kind of, framing neutrality as this archaic, outdated concept, and we need to meet might with might and build up our militaries and increase our military capacity and our arms production and all of this. So we discussed all of that in Colombia, and I think that Colombia was a very important first step in building this kind of movement that would promote an active neutrality across lots of different countries and contexts where there are, because people will often say, well, it's all very well and good being neutral in times of peace, but what about times of war? But a lot of the countries that were represented in Colombia were actually actively experiencing armed conflict or had done so in the past. Then I'll speak just very briefly on the EU, and then I'll hand over to Ed, because I think Ed is going to speak a bit more on Ireland. But yeah, just on the EU stuff, I think Ireland is a neutral country. We've been neutral since the foundation of the Irish state, and even beforehand. Ireland's neutrality was born out of the idea that we would not participate in imperialist wars. And probably Ed will speak a bit more about this, but our neutrality is very much under threat at the moment and for the last number of years because of our membership of the European Union. Also, of course, because of the role of the US in global politics, but very much the practical threat to the Irish neutrality stance at the moment is coming directly from the European Union, where the European Union, which started out as an economic union, became more a political union and is now very much a military union. It means that we are being dragged into a military alliance, which Ireland as a neutral country really, it's a violation of our neutrality. We have in the European Union, European public funds going to arms companies. Billions and billions of European Union public funding is going to arms companies that are right now arming Israel, for example. We had yesterday a group of UN experts call out arms companies and the financial institutions that are financing them for complicity in genocide. But then that also would follow then that EU is also complicit in genocide if we continue with European public money to fund arms companies that are arming Israel during what the ICJ has termed a plausible case of genocide. So that the membership of the EU really brings into question to what extent Ireland is able to maintain its neutrality or not. And yeah, I think, Ed, I'll probably hand over to you. I think you'll probably pick up a bit more on this and also in Shannon Airport. But yeah, I think I've probably said enough for now to be able to at least bring people in a discussion afterwards. And I'll hand it over to Ed for now. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Niamh, and thanks, Sean, and all those who have organised this excellent Peace Wave. Just by way of introduction, I'm Edward Horgan. I'm a retired major from the Irish Defence Forces. I used to be an expert on armoured warfare, and my last appointment in the military was in command of a tank squadron. Now, there were only little tanks, little Scorpion tanks, but at the same time, I always had reservations about Ireland trying to defend itself as in conventional warfare, the reality is that a country of less than 5 million couldn't possibly defend itself against not only the United States or Russia, but even middle-sized powers like France or the UK. The only way we could defend ourselves might be by guerrilla warfare, which is how we got our independence. But in the meantime, since we became independent, as Niamh mentioned, we have been a neutral state, and active neutrality is definitely the best means of protecting the Irish people. And the Irish people include a huge diaspora around the world. So international peace is of huge importance to us. I write quite a lot of letters to the papers, and I've written one in the last couple of days, which I'll just read out because it happens to spell out the situation with Irish neutrality at the moment, which is very much in danger and being constantly eroded. So it goes like this. Dear editor, humanity is needlessly being led to a cliff edge by reckless international leaders, as it was in 1914. World War III will be the West against the rest of humanity, and if it goes neutral, there will be no winners, and there may be no humanity at the end of it. Since the end of the Cold War, the US, with just over 4% of the world's population, has been misusing NATO and other allies, including Israel, to maintain its military and economic domination over the rest of humanity. It has achieved this so far by waging aggressive resource wars or instigating proxy wars in breach of the UN Charter and international laws that have cost the lives of millions of people in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Ukraine, and now Israel, Palestine, and elsewhere. Successive Irish governments have been complicit in these wars. Our traditional active neutrality has been abandoned step by step, including by joining NATO's so-called Partnership for Peace, which in reality is a partnership for wars, allowing US military to use Shannon Airport, sending Irish soldiers to serve with NATO missions and with the European Union neo-colonial missions in Africa, and planning to abandon the triple lock. The triple lock is a mechanism whereby Irish troops should only be sent overseas on a UN-approved mission. The Irish Defence Forces has been inexplicably downgraded, and the conditions of service of its members are so inadequate that this has led to a recruitment and retention crisis. Irish Defence Forces personnel are training Ukrainian soldiers and providing military equipment to the Ukrainian army, while Ukraine is engaged in a war with Russia, and this is a clear breach of neutrality. Ireland should be promoting international peace in the interest not only of the Irish people, but in the interest of all humanity. Supporting the West against the rest of humanity is putting Ireland on the wrong side of history and could lead to the end of humanity's history. Edward Horgan, Castletroy, Limerick. Again, Niamh mentioned the context of the European Union. The European Union has a total population of somewhere around 450 million. Of its 27 countries, 23 of them are now full members of the NATO since both Finland and Sweden abandoned their neutrality. That leaves just 4 small countries that are in theory neutral. Austria with about 10 million, Ireland about 5 million, Cyprus, I think about 750,000, and the Malta, which is tiny, so that the total population of the 4 so-called neutral countries within the European Union is less than 15 million people out of a European Union population of 450. All the major countries in the European Union are full members of NATO, and even those 4 that I mentioned, including Ireland, are also involved with Partnership for Peace or Partnership for War. What's been happening, as I mentioned in my letter there, is that since the end of the Cold War, the US has been using NATO in the role of a criminal enforcer in the US wars for resources. The US, NATO, break up the nation states and cause the deaths of millions of people. And including by imposing sanctions, which are doing tremendous damage also. What's happening at the moment in Gaza is being actively supported even by Ireland. I'll just read out an example. I do a lot of tracking of US military aircraft through Shannon Airport. Since 2001, tens of thousands of US military aircraft have passed through Shannon Airport for refueling purposes on their way to and from wars in the Middle East and now in Europe. Just yesterday, an Omni airplane, which is one of the civilian aircraft companies that transports US troops through Ireland, landed at Shannon Airport, coming from Fort Cavazos in Killeen, Texas. It landed at Shannon Airport yesterday about 1600 hours, took off again at 1800, flew on to Ramstein Air Base in Germany. It then flew from there to Rizau. Now, those of you who don't know where Rizau is, it's on the borders with Ukraine and southeastern Poland. It's now one of the main supply airports or air bases for equipment and NATO soldiers going into Ukraine. It flew from there to Kuwait, which is also a major distribution area in the Middle East for US soldiers who might be going to Israel or Syria or wherever. It then turned around and early this morning landed at Shannon Airport for about an hour or two on its way back to the United States, and it has since landed in Pope Air Base in North Carolina. That's just one aircraft. There would have been several aircraft like that passed through yesterday. And even today, I've been doing a bit of tracking, and two US Air Force executive type planes, one coming from Rome and I think Geneva, and the other one coming from Kuwait. So clearly, a neutral state should not be assisting countries at war. The reality is that Irish neutrality has been very significantly corroded, and in reality, we are no longer neutral. Neutrality was the solution for peace in Europe at the end of the Cold War, but the US felt that it had the ability to remain the dominant power and to keep a stranglehold on the resources of the world. What would have been the ideal solution would have been a band of neutral states, beginning with Finland, the Baltic states, Belarus, Ukraine, Romania, and Bulgaria. And of course, Russia should have been welcomed into the European community and made every effort to achieve that. But this was opposed by the United States. Promises were broken. The war in Ukraine would not have happened and should not have happened, even if just Ukraine remained neutral. I've worked in both Russia and in Ukraine on election monitoring. I observed the elections in Kharkiv in 2010, in which Yanukovych was very democratically elected. I was working with the OSCE. He was subsequently overthrown violently, and that coup, in the view of many observers, was organized partly by the CIA. I also observed the elections in Russia in 2018. Not quite as democratic, but not nearly as undemocratic as many people believe also. The Helsinki Agreement, which was almost agreed to and would have allowed Ukraine to be a neutral country and to cooperate both with the West and with the European Union as well as with Russia. But because this did not suit the United States and its neoliberal conspiracy, the war has gone on with tens of thousands, possibly even hundreds of thousands of fatalities in the meantime. What's happening in Gaza is also being supported by Ireland and by the European Union. As Niamh mentioned, the European Union started off as an economic organisation, and a reasonably good one from that point of view. It portrayed itself as a union for peace, and to some extent that was genuine. It did succeed in making peace between Germany and France in particular in Europe. Now that has been abandoned. Effectively, NATO has usurped the European Union. As I mentioned earlier on, of the 27 European Union states, 23 of them are full members of NATO, and the 4 small ones, Austria, Ireland, Cyprus, and Malta, are effectively no longer neutral to a very large extent. So the history and the present situation is now so dangerous, as several people, including our colleagues from the UK, have mentioned. We are now in real danger of a nuclear war. In 1984, even though I was with a neutral army, I attended as an observer a large NATO British Army on the Rhine exercise in Germany. At that stage, there was a real danger, in fact, that because the Soviet Union was economically going bust, that they might risk attacking in the West to try and salvage the Soviet Union. In those exercises, which would have involved brigade and division levels, I attended some of the briefings, and at that stage, it was quite clear, in fact, that if the Soviet Union crossed the borders into Western Germany, nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, would be used. It is very likely that if there is a NATO versus the Russian war in the near future, tactical weapons will be used by both sides. And the reality is that both Russia and the United States, in my view, have a forced use of nuclear weapons, and not just the ability to respond to a nuclear attack. The reality is that the MAD, the MAD, mutually assured destruction, means that the country that uses nuclear weapons first is likely to wipe out most of the nuclear weapons on the other side. So countries like the US and Russia know that they may not have a second chance if they don't use their nuclear weapons first. Many people don't realize just how serious the risk of nuclear war is. And it's a huge risk for humanity. What's happening in Gaza is genocide, but also the risk of a nuclear exchange in the Middle East if Israel sees itself to be targeted. Clearly, Hamas or Lebanon or those smaller countries don't have that ability, and neither does Iran. But even so, Israel has somewhere up to 200 nuclear bombs stored in the Sinai Desert, in the Negev, the Negev rather than Sinai. There is also a significant risk of a nuclear exchange if relationships between India and Pakistan occur. That's quite, I suppose, a depressing prospect, but not enough has been done to prevent it. Niamh mentioned the very optimistic situation with the Congress in Colombia. And again, I think it's important to remain hopeful, and the possibility into the future of other countries in Latin America and elsewhere adopting neutrality is both hopeful and optimistic. Feel free to ask me any questions later on if you want me to expand further. And thank you all very much for your attention and for the great work we are all doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ed, for that extremely detailed and comprehensive view into neutrality and its role, particularly in Europe and relating to major conflicts that we're seeing. And thank you to Niamh as well for the excellent summary of the Neutrality Congress in Colombia, and for also explaining, the connections of active neutrality, the importance of active neutrality as really a tool for peace. So I think this has given us really a wonderful overview. We have about 10 minutes now before we move on to our next segment of the Peace Wave. And I know there are a few questions in the chat, so I'll turn them over to you here, maybe just with a few words of my own thrown in as well. But I think the first question, Ed, was just to you about, you had mentioned a recent publication you had, and I think someone was asking if you would be able to post that into the chat so that people could read more on that when they have some time. And then there's also a few comments thanking you, Ed, as well, and mentioning that there were 2 U.S. veterans from the Veterans for Peace Network that went to Shannon's Runway to stop the military flights who were taken into custody. Then we have quite an open question, which I think I hope we'll answer over these 24 hours, which is, what is the state of the international peace movement? And does World Beyond War work with other peace groups in the world? Just quickly on both of those questions, I think 24 hours of peace activities around the world show that the state of the peace movement is strong. It, of course, can always be stronger. There's plenty of work to do, and we need as many people as possible to do it. I'll leave it at that, and I'm sure Ed and Niamh, you'll have more to say on that. And World Beyond War and IPB together are partnering on this. So World Beyond War certainly does work with other peace groups around the world. And I know there are many others that are part of our 24 hours here that will show that. Then there's also the question, just for some more details about the meeting in Colombia. What was the title? When did it take place? And then just some other words of thank you. So I'll turn the floor over to you to answer any of those questions, or maybe also to react to what each other have said. The floor is to both of you. I don't know who would like to go first. Ed, please.
Yeah, you mentioned the 2 US peace activists, 2 very good friends of mine, as it happens. I'm a member of Veterans for Peace, and as it happens, I'm also on the board of World Beyond War. So I'm involved with almost too many international peace groups, which keeps me quite busy. Tara Kauf and Ken Myers climbed in over the fence, or cut their way through the fence at Shannon Airport, and went to inspect some US military aircraft. They were duly arrested, as is normal in such cases. Usually in such cases, in fact, I have actually gone into Shannon Airport on a number of occasions myself. I've been arrested on 6 occasions. I've been prosecuted on those 6 occasions. Only once was I convicted. So much so I was getting a bit embarrassed. People were wondering whose side I might have been on. But in my most recent case, I was found not guilty of damaging a US Navy plane on the basis of just cause or justification, but then found guilty in theory of trespass in order to do that. But Ken and Tarek were prevented for 9 months on going back to the States because their passport was held. So in effect, while the trial was being delayed, they were virtually imprisoned in Ireland. However, they spent their time touring Ireland and promoting international peace and Irish neutrality. So what's of huge importance, in fact, is the international cooperation among international peace groups. A small country like Ireland, or a small number of peace groups in Ireland, can't achieve much on our own. That's why the Congress in Colombia was so important. And that's why organizations like the Veterans for Peace, World Beyond War are also essential. I am finding in recent times that there is a burnout situation with peace activists. The situation in Gaza is so horrendous that people are having difficulty coping with it. But it's vital that we continue and that we remain optimistic as much as possible.
Well, I'll come in a bit on the peace movement as well, maybe following on a bit from what Ed said, actually. I think on the international peace movement, I was actually, before this call started, myself and Sean were just remembering that this time last year we were having the Peace Summit in Vienna, the peace gathering that we had in Vienna for calling for peace in Ukraine. And we were all, there were lots of media articles in the papers or at that time calling us all pro-Russian mouthpieces or whatever. And there was, the peace movement felt very kind of fractured and divided over whether or not to send weapons to Ukraine. And it felt like we were very small and insignificant in a way, even though there were still a number of us with our voices calling out the idea that you would respond to war with more war. But it felt like we were very fragmented and broken and kind of sidelined. And I think if you fast forward to where we are today, just taking my own hometown of Ennis in County Clare as an example, every single week in Ennis since the 7th of October, there is a march around the town of Ennis and many towns around Ireland calling for an end to the genocide in Gaza. And that call to the end for genocide in Gaza encompasses all of the asks of an anti-war movement. So it's no US military through Shannon Airport, calling for an arms embargo, calling for a ceasefire. So very much the situation in Palestine has really galvanized movements around the world to come out and call for a stop to the warmongering and to the expansive, militarization and this idea that weapons are the answer when in fact they're the biggest part of the problem. So I think I'm actually more positive now about the peace movement and where we are than I was a year ago, because I think people see that if we don't stop the genocide in Gaza, then what's next? This is actually a crisis of humanity. I think it was Antonio Guterres who said this isn't a humanitarian crisis, it's a crisis of humanity. And if we don't manage to stop this and reverse it, then what's next? And I think people that were probably never politically active before are finding themselves out on the streets because they simply cannot sleep at night with what Ed was saying, with the absolute horror that is being live streamed from Gaza day and night for the last 8+ months. People cannot in good, how can you have finding it really hard to even get on with their day? Like Ed said, there's a burnout. A lot of people are really struggling. And I think coming together and going out to protest is actually a way of feeling, well, I'm not alone. There are people, there is a movement, there's a global movement, there's millions of people on the streets around the world every single weekend for the last 8+ months. So I think even whether they come together under the banner of World Beyond War or IPB or other banners or titles or whatever, I think the fact that every single week in my hometown in Ennis, but in Dublin, in Limerick, in Galway, in Shannon Airport once a month, and there's a growing peace movement in Ireland, like in lots of other places around the world, it's a sign. And also I think, just because I usually live in the Netherlands, actually, seeing the way the Dutch police responded to the students that occupied peaceful protest in the universities in the Netherlands, students that took to the area in front of the university in Amsterdam, peacefully set up an encampment. And within hours, the Dutch police came in and ransacked the camp and bulldozed it and arrived in with bulldozers and dogs to evict the students within hours of setting up a peaceful protest camp. When you see that level of violence being used against peaceful protesters again and again over a number of days, because the peace activists kept coming back and not accepting that they were going to be moved on, that is a sign that they're losing. I mean, if you have to inflict that level of violence on peaceful protesters, it's because you have lost control. You have no control if you're marching into a peaceful camp with a bulldozer. And so I think there is a massive global moment. I think there is a global shift. I'm sure as the peace wave continues, I love the idea of the peace wave. And I love the way we kind of started in Ireland in a way, even though the first videos were from Britain. But I love the idea that there's a peace wave. And I do think that it is reflective of the fact that there is a peace wave taking place around the world. And I think it will only get stronger. I think we have no other choice. The stakes are too high. and there is a burnout, but then there's also a recognition that we have to keep going. And when people are low, other people pick them up, and we have events like this or in-person events that help us to carry on. So yeah, so just to say thanks again to Sean, to Emily, and to everyone organising this, and also to Ed for sharing the discussion on Ireland. It's been great. So yeah, I think that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Maybe just one final point, and maybe a very important point. The destruction of international and humanitarian law is unprecedented in the history of international law. And if Israel and the US and others who are supporting them get away with the genocide in Gaza, and in the short and medium term, unfortunately, it's likely they will get away with it. But if they get away with it in the long term, it will be atrocious. I have researched genocide in quite a lot of depth over the years. One of the reasons genocide keeps happening is that it has proven to be successful in many cases, going right back to the German genocide in Southwest Africa, the Armenian genocide perpetrated by the Ottoman Turks, and to some extent, even the Holocaust, in a terrible way, did succeed from a German Nazi point of view of getting rid of 6 million Jewish people almost, and then exporting the problem from Europe into Palestine. And now we see what's happening in Palestine, and Israel, supported by the US very actively, in front of our eyes, committing genocide into our television rooms on a nightly basis. If this is allowed and to be successful, and there's a real danger that it might be, then the whole concept of international law being shredded is of huge importance.
Thank you, Edward. Thank you, Niamh, so much for all of your contributions here. This has been a wonderful first hour. We still have 23 hours ahead of us of peace activities. And so we hope many of you will stick on as long as you can for the different sections that we have. We are now moving to West Africa, but just very quickly before we do, I know neutrality can be a very wide and tough to fully understand topic. I wanted to, just because we had some questions we didn't get to at the very end of the chat there, briefly mention that neutrality does not mean taking a stand against human rights violations, sorry, so I said that backwards. Neutrality does not mean that you don't take a stand against human rights violations, war crimes, etc. But it gives you more of a privileged position to do so because you are neutral to the parties that are conflict. You are not directly engaging in the conflict for one side or another, but engaging in a way that promotes peace, promotes resolution, and also calls out when there are war crimes, human rights violations. So I think, it is a deep topic, and of course, in 1 hour, we can't explore it fully here. We will post a link in our chat. Both Ed and Niamh were part of an educational webinar series that we did earlier this year on neutrality. So we'll post a link to that for anyone who's interested in learning some more there. But because now we are in our second hour, I would then turn the conversation over to our partners for the West African region. Here we have Rashid, and we also have Ernest with us, who will introduce the panel that will speak on peace in West Africa. So Ernest and Rashid, are you with us?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Hi, Sean. Great. So hi everyone, my name is Rashid, and I'll be moderating the session for the African continent on for today on the Peace Wave 2024. And joining me will be Ernest. Ernest will be supporting, and he's the regional coordinator, and he's going to give us a brief on what the discussion is today. But before I go into that, I think I'll allow Ernest to give a brief presentation on what IPB is and the context of today's meeting. Ernest, you're up.
Thank you, Rashid, for giving me the opportunity to also give a brief about IPB and the program entirely. And we say thank you to all of the attendants, and we are grateful and happy to have you guys on board. And basically, the International Peace Bureau, the organization we have been working with for quite a while now, and our mission is basically working with world leaders to cut down military expenditures and also to invest into humanitarian works. And we have also embarked on several programs on peace, common security, and so forth. And we also have the African chapter of the International Peace Bureau, which we have been managing for quite a while now, preparing basic programs to run to benefit the African continent. So basically, today we are here also to also give our input to contribute towards the 24-hour peace save. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernest. And as the theme of this year is no to militarization and yes to cooperation, for the African section, we'll be having 3 panelists. And let me introduce Mr. Teddy Fode Musa. He's the National Coordinator for SPSP Sierra Leone and a lecturer at the Department of Peace and Conflict Studies at Fure Bay College in Sierra Leone. Mr. Teddy, could you say hi to the audience if you're there?
Yeah, thank you, Rashid. I just want to bring a peaceful greetings to everybody from West Africa. Thank you for having me.
All right, thank you. And we have the current president of the Society for Peace Studies and Practice, SPSP, and the chair, the coordinating committee of the Forum on Farmers and Elders Relations in Nigeria. 20 years of experience in the non-profit sector in peace building, education, and social roles, including as a national facilitator for the Justice and Security Dialogue Program of the United States Institute of Peace. We have Mr. Nathaniel Nsem Awapila. Mr. Nsem, can you say hi to everyone? Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. And the next panelist is Igwesin Augustine. He's Executive Director and is a Peace Building and Development Practitioner. He currently serves as the Executive Director at the Center for Peace Advocacy and Sustainable Development in Nigeria. Mr. Augustine, could you say hi to everyone first?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right. Welcome. So the topic for today, we're looking at the importance of peace and security in Africa and to the sector, and we're looking at the thematic area of the demilitarization and sustainable security in Africa. And the viewers and guests will take a brief introduction into the topic and what are the perspectives on the current state of militarization in Africa. And Mr. Are you there? Mr. Nathaniel, are you there?
Oh, sure, I am. Yes, I am here with you. Thank you.
All right. So following our conversation for today, we want to look at what militarization and the impact of militarization has been in Africa and how it has depleted the efforts and the resources meant for development of Africa, and how this has created a lot of insecurity. But looking forward and beyond that, how do we address these issues? But let's go to the root of the conversation. Could you tell us the key drivers of militarization in Africa? And so we can get a foundation of what it is in Africa, the context of militarization in Africa, and the current situation in Africa.
Thank you once again for the opportunity. There are a number of drivers of militarization in Africa, but I could mention a few of them. And the first that comes to mind is the prolonged existence of military regimes across Africa. And because military leadership has persisted across Africa, it has also validated military action as an option. So across many parts of Africa, when there is violence, when communities rise up to protest, the first thing is peace enforcement. Now, peace enforcement is not supposed to be the first thing to do until violence has broken out and things are that serious. But it tends to be the first thing that our leaders do. And so that is because military leaderships have validated military action. You also see police officers and all of these moving around the streets armed. Because to them, that looks like that's the way to bring order to society. And therefore, this makes kinetic approaches to insecurity on the continent, favored by most people, leaders and citizens. And that's the first one, so prolonged military regimes. The second one is a dominant feeling that our leaders don't listen to peaceful voices. And so even communities that feel aggrieved, feel marginalized, feel like nobody cares, are no longer using the peaceful option of speaking and hoping to be heard. So a subculture that promotes military options, insurgency, banditry, kidnapping for ransom, and endemic presence of violent extremism across Africa has taken root. And so when people feel like nobody cares, then they don't really care about the options they are going to try. A third reason I find is the feeling of helplessness by communities who feel marginalized and neglected. In a society where leadership listens to everybody that has concerns, you will not have people feeling helpless. But in Nigeria, where I live, we have seen the presence of Niger Delta militancy, which arose from a simple, request for the people in the Niger Delta region to have a certain percentage of the national wealth that originates from their region. And that led to killings during the military regimes. And today we have had the Niger Delta militancy. It has become a household name. You talk of Islamic fundamentalism in parts of Nigeria and the Sahelian region. You talk of militarization of ethnic tensions in the Ambazonia region of Cameroon, the Hutu versus Tutsi situation in Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Liberia, violence. All of this is, there's another reason, and this is, I see it very specific to Rwanda and Liberia. I see it, the fact of lack of commitment by global leaders in creating the Hutu Tutsi genocide in other parts of Africa. When the global leader doesn't it's an African problem. It's a West African problem. Then it catches up to the fifth one, which I see for African and the sub-regional bodies, ECOWAS in West Africa and the other parts. Their failure to act proactively has resulted in Africa to 7 military regimes over the past 3 years alone. Between 2020 and 2023, we saw Mali, Guinea, Sudan, Burkina Faso, Niger, come under the leadership of military juntas. And people like it. You probably saw in the media where the people of Niger came out to around the streets rejoicing that they have military regime instead of civilian leadership. So the failure of the African Union to act proactively has also promoted militarization and military options across Africa. And as a matter of fact, to be very specific about the case of Niger, when ECOWAS finally decided to act, they used a threat rather than seeking dialogue. And that wasn't the scenario between ECOWAS and Niger, and has now created a sub-body within the region where the few countries that are under military regimes have now created a platform for themselves, which they call this, what I can't remember the exact name, but a platform for countries in the Sahel. So the failure is important. A cause and effect, and this is a medley of quite a number of factors for me, and that's the sixth and the last I will mention. A cause and effect pattern exists across Africa. A loss of respect for human rights, culture of impunity. It's very key. This also has created an environment for gross corruption, and this corruption now also becomes a root cause, promoting military options. People get armed. You have all kinds of ammunitions during elections. You see people come out with arms and ammunition like they are going to war. And then you also see it happen across, violent extremism, thuggery, high-level crimes by people in leadership. So these are some 6 reasons I could mention, and that is not exhaustive, that explain militarization and military options across the country.
Thank you, Mr. Natale, for that wonderful foundation to this discussion. And then you mentioned some key elements, and in the conversation, aside the this subtle challenge between 2 countries in Africa, well, we likely and most of the times, have inter-country conflict, but it is usually intra-conflict conflict within Africa. You have within Nigeria having their intra-country conflicts. You have in Rwanda. You have in Kenya. You have in Sierra Leone. You have in Congo, DR Congo, and the likes. And now, Mr. Teddy, in looking at these these challenges, how do we address regional cooperation on having a sit down and an agreement that internal conflict needs to be reduced because in Eastern Europe or between Asia, between America, for example, and the US or Russia and the US, you have 2 countries going at loggerheads. But it is not the situation in Africa most of the times. But then we have much more wars, much more conflict and security challenges within countries in Africa. And the African Union Peace and Security Council has not been technically able to provide solutions to that. What do you think of that? How do we, and which then gives them the opportunity for militarization within a country and not preparing for, is not them preparing for war against other countries, but it is more about creating more arms and to create internal conflict. How do we address these situations?
Thank you very much for the question. And let me also thank Mr. President for taking the lead on this. It sounds very interesting. And what I want to do is to see how I can start putting things into the historical perspectives in terms of militarization, because this is where it has all started. And if we are talking about a solution, it is good we look at how it all began. He has gone through to label up to 6 factors responsible drivers for militarization. I have designed 3 because I want to use my country, Sierra Leone, as a case study here. And those 3 contexts actually fit into the case scenario of Sierra Leone. So one of the drivers I have identified are the artificial borders that were created by colonialism. Yeah, when the colonialists came, it was basically, especially for West Africa, a tussle between the British and the English, the British and the French. And this is why, for instance, we have countries wherein, like Cameroon, you have a portion of French and the realization of the English. So those artificial borders that they left behind had been creating a lot of, concerns. Militarization has taken a hold on them. For instance, we all know about the Libya-Chad, border conflict. And there was another border conflict between Burkina Faso and Mali. Of course, Nigeria and Cameroon over the Bakassi Peninsula. So these are issues. These are the issues responsible for the militarization. If you put that into the context of my country, Sierra Leone, we as well have an issue of similar phase, which is the border, the Yenga border crisis between Guinea and Sierra Leone. Yenga is a border town that is allocated to the Sierra Leonean territory. But when the war started in 1991, Guinea, which is a neighboring country, was not very pleased that they were thinking that the war might have a spillover from Sierra Leone to that of Guinea. And so the closest point they came to sort of prevent their own border was occupying that Yenga. So they were there serving quite some necessary purpose in terms of supporting the government of Sierra Leone against the rebels. But after the war ended, because they have established, the soldiers refused to go back. So that Yenga issue is an issue. It has been coming up, it has been rearing up its ugly head, and to a point that they had to contact the British Colonial Office in the UK to actually present a clear map as to which country actually lays a better claim over Yenga, whether it is Guinea or Sierra Leone. So that is just one context of it. Another context, I think the president actually spoke about it, which is the military coup factor. I think in Africa alone, we've had over 200 military coups, and not to talk of those failed coups, and half of those have succeeded. In the context of my country, Sierra Leone, you find out that we had the independence in the independence came about in 1961, and in 1967 we had the first military coup. In 1992, the second military coup came with the NPRC guys, just when the war started, a year. And then 1997, the AFRC coup as well came just after we went outside of the 1996 elections. So you find out that the military coup factor as well has been taking hold within the context of a country, and that as well is a driver in terms of militarization. And the third one I would want to bring out is the civil war and that of the liberation struggle. I mean, we all know of liberation struggle, for instance, like what was ongoing in that of South Africa, the apartheid system. But for the case of my own country, Sierra Leone, I think the civil war example is a very good one. We had a very, very brutal civil war, which promoted militarization to a very large extent. I don't think any Sierra Leonean will not be ashamed of what happened within that 11-year civil war. It was a war that started in 1991 and came to an end in 2002. So basically, with all of these factors, hitting out to your question, I think we have to see how we can leverage diplomacy in all of this. And if we are talking about diplomacy here, we want to begin to see how best we can have regional cooperation along that. For West Africa, which is really my own case study, and narrowing down to the Mano River Union Basin. The Mano River Union Basin consists initially of 3 countries, Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone. Ivory Coast has been added of recently. So we now have 4 countries. I think it is good if we can see how best those countries can collaborate around, the area of diplomacy in trying to fix some of these things. It comes out in the sense that once good governance is not properly placed, you will obviously have the military guys jumping in the name of military coups. And when that happens, then it becomes a problem. It sets the time back in terms of democracy. So I think what we should be doing here is, if diplomacy could stand out in terms of addressing good governance in the sense have a kind of not going the right way, set up mechanisms in terms of early warning signs, conflict resolution mechanisms, for instance, to see how they can call certain leaders to action if at all things are not working the right way they should be working. So basically, I think in order to address all of this and to answer your question, diplomacy is the best, which can start from sub-regional organizations like the MRU, the Mano River Union countries, then down to the regional organization in terms of talking about the ECOWAS, moving down to the AU. I think they might need to set a kind of conflict resolution mechanism in those countries and see how they can start resolving their question. Like, for instance, the Yenga border issue. I think it has to start with the MRU. Thank you very
Okay.
much. I give it over to you.
Ready for that. And this conversation they've mentioned and the possible solutions that could actually reduce and find the leveraging mechanism like the African Union, the ECOWAS, and the like. Now, to Mr. Augustine, if I would ask you that how have military alliances and foreign military interventions impacted peace, security, and development in different African nations? What are the major two things that you could possibly mention? I mean, in that regards, if you look at the positive and negative impacts of how military alliance and foreign military interventions has impacted peace, as Mr. Teddy has mentioned, there are coups and there are some countries that have to call in foreign aid, and the francophone countries have to use France as a mechanism for or a system for managing peace in their countries, which has also been a challenge. So if I'll put this question to you, Mr. Augustine, how have military alliances and foreign military interventions impacted peace, security, and development in different African nations?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, sorry. I'm trying to, the network here is not quite okay. I'm trying to save some that, so I cannot turn on camera. So from your question, you say how military alliances are impacted peace and security and development in different part of Africa. So I will take on this perspective that military alliances and foreign military intervention have actually divert impact on peace and security, also and development in African nation. This has to do with the impact are far-fetched in looking at how it caused a kind of instability and conflict escalation. If we look at military bases in Africa, especially in Chad, in Niger, and other part of the Sahel region where you have the US military base, and you can see the expansion of a Russia military base coming to Africa and other European powers. You see how this has to have resulted to instability and conflict escalation in Africa. So this has a far impact on economic development of Africa. There's also a kind of a human right abuse and civilian casualty, looking at how these military alliances and the foreign military intervention carry their their military intervention. It also look at evaluating some human rights and also look at some civilian casualty. Also, there is a kind of dependency on power undermine national sovereignty. So if you look at some military alliances and the foreign military intervention, some nations are depending on external powers like having military bases trying to, in the Sahel where you have military bases trying to protect the Sahel. So it also tries to undermine the sovereignty of that country and all of that. Also, there is a kind of displacement and refugee crisis. This also has an impact on displacement and refugee crisis. And also there is economic burden and resource exploitations. So those military alliances and foreign military interventions, some of them come to Africa, they also have economic burden on the country, and there's also a kind of a resource exploitation. Some of these alliances and military interventions exploit the mineral resources in the Africa where they are based. Some of them take advantage of their present, explore mineral resources, explore opportunities available to those countries, and they take advantage of these countries because they depend on them for the kind of security and protection. And from there, they exploit them of different mineral resources they have across Africa. If you look at what is happening in Niger, recently the presence of France in Niger, but the Niger people are beginning to push them away because those military interventions or alliances are beginning to exploit what they have in their country. Because of this, it has far impact on them. So I look at it in 5 broad areas. Looking at it, the impact I can say we look at the instability and conflict escalation. I looked at the human rights violation and civilian casualty. So I look at dependency on power, external power, undermining national sovereignty, and also look at displacement and refugee crisis. And the last one I look at is the economic burden and resource exploitation. So all of these are some of the impact of those military alliances and intervention in Africa, especially in the Sahel region, where you have some military, foreign military presence, both in the Sahel and in the other part of Africa, where you have some military presence. Even the recent Russia coming to Africa to have some military presence, it will have far-fetched impact, not even not in the long run, it will have impact. So all of these are contributing to very contribute to have impact on how African control their military and security architecture in the continent.
Thank you,
So I
Augustine.
think I look at there could be an alternative approach to this. So there could be an alternative approach to this. I look at African led peacekeeping and conflict resolution initiative can help to look at this impact. I also look at regional economic community integration and effort. I also look at capacity building for national security forces. Like other speakers, I may look at diplomacy, mediation, dialogue. I also look at humanitarian assistance and development aid, encouraging democratic governance and human rights, and also supporting local peace building initiative and reconciliation, and fostering international cooperation and multilateralism. So some of these are alternative approach to what I've mentioned earlier, and I believe that it will go a long way in emphasizing how African agencies and self-determined solution. This alternative can prioritize sustainable peace and security and development in African nations.
If I may pause you a bit, Augustine, and I would like to bring Mr. Nathaniel back. The budget, and if you look at the budget of militarization and defense in African countries, for example, in Nigeria, the Ministry of Defense and then the budget for weapons are quite higher than the budget for education, quite higher than the budget for healthcare, quite higher than some other infrastructures. And what do you think? How do you think this? I mean, when you're trying to buy more weapons, militarize the continent, and you have other countries because of their own conflict and the need to assert their dominance and hegemony, find African countries as their battlefield to conquer, and try as much as possible to militarize them, both covertly and some other ways. What do you think of that, Mr. Nathaniel?
Thank you very much. And without going into statistics at all, you're so correct in talking about the huge budgets that go to support defense and military action across Africa. And interestingly, there's no accountability that this is how much you spend. But I give an example. Let me give very examples close to home. I live in a state called Benue State. Benue State is located on the it's the north central part of Nigeria, but it shares a boundary with Cameroon. A few years ago, some 4 or 5 years ago, no, it's more now, some 8 years ago, the Ambazonian War started like a joke in Cameroon. Within the very short time, 6,000 people, as recorded, were affected and displaced. Between 2015, 2016, and today, as we're speaking, we still have thousands of those displaced people living in my state as refugees. There has been no effort to get them back. These people live in places where there's no budget for their education, there's no plan for their, for their return to their countries. Are you talking about health? There are no plans for that. Now, that is just one country. But let me talk about my state, the same Benue state that is accommodating refugees. It's a state that by estimate has about 7 million people. And over a period of 2011 to 2023, out of the 7 million people, about 1.5 have been displaced by violent conflicts that happen annually and annually. A lot of money is spent on deploying the military to the communities who come and compound the situation because they come and they displace more people. No effort to return these people to their ancestral homes. No education. Food insecurity has gotten to a point where food you could buy very easily a couple of years ago, now you can't afford to buy it with 500% of the money you could take care of your home. So the budget that goes to military action is huge compared to investment in what really matters. Welfare is not an issue that is a top priority for government. But that's because of the mindset. That is because the government looks at things, you can reduce all of these actions to kinetic actions for addressing insecurity and non-kinetic actions for addressing insecurity. And governments have preferred to utilize kinetic actions, and they invest in it hugely. Is it China? China will give you millions of dollars worth of arms to fight your battles, your internal wars. Is it America? Is it Russia? Is it France? They will give it to you. But you're going to spend the next generation or the next 1, 2, 3 generations of your citizens paying for all of those ammunitions. So we need to, our people, as a government, as a continent, we need to reevaluate the basis for the policies that are formulated. If we place education, healthcare, and social welfare as the top priorities, in the next 5, 10 to 15 years, we may not need to budget up to 20% on military action. But because that's not the priority, and I must say, based on the level of relationship I have with key government officials, I realize it's not that they don't want to do things differently. It's because of capacity. It's because of fear of exploring the non-kinetic options that exist. And so they keep doing the same thing and situation is not changing, but they just keep doing it, hoping that somehow
all right, Mr. Nathaniel.
There will be restored security.
Yeah. I think it's quite important. And from your last statement, rethinking security priorities. And I want to ask Mr. Teddy. Mr. Teddy, what are the successful examples of grassroots peace building? Because as we have in Syria alone when the conflict was there, and what successful grassroots peace building, conflict resolution, and non-violent resistance movement can be highlighted and amplified across the continent? I want you to take that in 2 minutes. I don't know if you got the question, Mr. Nathaniel. Mr. Teddy, did you get that?
Okay, 2 minutes.
Yes.
Yes. Grassroots organizations are very much important to peace building. In the context of our own country, we had our civil war, 1991 to 2002. And when that war came to an end, we had a challenge of reconciling Sierra Leoneans because there was a kind of very big divide. We started off with that of the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation, in which case people were to come and sort of confess, and then reconcile. But that was like not part of our own cultural makeup. For us, if you have wronged somebody, coming to stand in his or her face to tell it to him that, yes, I'm the man who did it, it's a little bit insulting. So the TRC was not going down very well. The other reason why the TRC as well could not survive, it's because it was established adjacently by the special court. So those who were supposed to come and make confessions in the TRC saw the TRC as a kind of conduit to link them over to the special court. So it failed. But lucky we are that a Sierra Leonean by the name of John Colker came up with a grassroots initiative called Fambul Talk. Fambul Talk is a Creole description of family relationship. It means we are families, let us sit down and talk. It became very successful because it replicated what we are looking forward to. Sierra Leoneans, we think once the conflict was over, there was the need for us to sit down and talk. Talk in the sense that we hang on to reconciliation, not recalling what happened anymore. And that was the route that John Colker and his Fambul Talk actually took. For them, they went to communities and they decided to bring them together, tell them that this is over, it is time for us to reconcile. So in Sierra Leone today, we have the Fambul Talk that is still in existence. It started as a civil society organization. It is headed by John Colker. It has made huge impact. It even had its own good records over the TRC that was funded by the US and the international community. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. And I mean, that would then take me to Augustine. Mr. Terry has mentioned our grassroots and how the people getting involved and having proper conflict resolution and looking forward to the future of providing a sustainable environment for the people of Africa. So as the executive director, and I know you've been being a very strong peace advocate, and not just that, but for sustainable development, what areas do you think we can do better in Africa? And from your experiences, what has been the experience you've seen so far, and how has putting in this effort helped to create more better sustainability and reducing militarization?
Hello?
Augustine, just 2 minutes,
Sorry.
please.
Yes, can you come again?
No, I asked that with your experience, what have you seen and what have you participated in that has helped in providing conflict resolution and for sustainable development? Just 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you so much. Across Africa, maybe I will speak on the young people perspective where we are fully engaged. There have been a lot of intervention in terms of seeing how Africa can be very secured. If you remember, African Union silencing the gun by 2020. There's this African Union Agenda 2063. I think one of the aspiration, it has 7 aspiration. And one of the aspiration talks about a peaceful and secure Africa. On that, there's a major implementation strategy. And one of the implementation strategies talks about silencing the guns in Africa. So it's a continental program of African Union where it gauge how we can demilitarize, as well as how we can take guns away from young people and replace them with a sustainable development strategy across Africa. So that intervention ended in 2020, but there's some gaps on it, and it achieved a significant impact where a lot of intervention were done to ensure that guns and guns, especially light weapons, a lot of protocols are being implemented by member states to ensure that light weapons are taken away, and guns, there's a lot of demilitarization, there's a lot of disarmament, and all of this program actually has significant impact, and they achieve a kind of sustainable, especially also the African Continental Framework on Youth, Peace and Security. These are major interventions that have been able to, see how peace are returned to African and sustainable development. Looking at it from the member states have actually started implementing also National Action Plan on Youth, Peace and Security. These are interventions that are bringing young people to the table to ensure that they contribute to peace building effort in Africa. And African Union on its part also looking at various interventions that will ensure de-escalation of violence, and the early warning, early response mechanism are in place. A lot of continental intervention, continental meetings to ensure that member states begin to implement some of the protocols and some of the interventions that have been designed by the African Union to ensure that there is a demilitarization, there is a lot of intervention going on across the continent.
Thank you so much, Augustine. And yeah, from what you've said, exactly, and the Peace African Peace Council, Security Council, I think one of their main and core agreement is to make sure that there is no war in Africa, and they always try as much as they need to de-escalate it. Unfortunately, we have the internal conflict in countries, but I mean, these documents and these policies and efforts to achieve these things, if properly implemented, we should have a direction. However, so I'll go back to the audience. There are questions here, and then I think anyone that wants to have a question can raise their hand and then make their comment. Or I have a question from
Rashid.
Yes. Go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt you here. But I just wanted to say, since we are nearing the end of our segment here, we have a couple of videos that we would like to show that have been submitted from other groups. Unfortunately, that means we will not have much time for the Q&A. I know this has been a really information-rich 45-minute session here. So I would offer, we have a couple of questions already in the chat. And I would ask the speakers if they wouldn't mind staying on the call a little bit longer. You can also answer the questions in written form in the chat so that we can continue the conversation there, because I think these are very good questions. But unfortunately, since we have this 24 hours, we have to keep moving around the globe. And so we'll go on now to a couple videos. But just again, to thank Rashid, Ernest, for putting this excellent panel together. And thank Mr. Teddy and Mr. Nathaniel as well for the really deep and important insights that we've gotten from you. I think we will certainly be organizing further discussions on this topic. And then I briefly wanted to mention, I know I had written in the chat, but we had hoped also to have, of course, a gender-balanced panel here, some women discussing, unfortunately, due to some last-minute issues, that was not possible. But in future discussions, of course, we will highlight this, and you can also visit the IPB YouTube channel to hear those various insights. But once again, a huge thank you to our panelists. It's wonderful to learn so much from you, and we look forward to the future opportunities to do so. For now, however, we will turn to two videos, the first of which will be a campaign that World Beyond War, IPB, and several others are supporting to remove foreign military bases from from Djibouti. And then afterwards, we'll have another video on Cameroon tackling gun violence. So I think we're ready to queue up the first video now.
Djibouti's repressive government is funded by foreign military bases. People don't want it. We have a petition with thousands of signatures, which is being delivered today to consulates around the world to say, no, get your troops out of Djibouti. I have a delivery for the Consul General. Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. I have a delivery for the Consul General. Okay. No, I have a delivery for the Consul General.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I have a package for the Consul General.
Here I am in front of the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa, ready to deliver the petition with 2,000 signatures. The gentleman met me at the door, said it doesn't work like that. He's going to take in my ID and he's going to get permission for me to deliver the envelope with the signatures from more than 2,000 people, asking them to close the base in Djibouti. So I will keep you informed and let you know what happens with that.
So what is your policy? I just want to know, what is your policy?
I'm sorry, I need to report back to people. What is your policy?
If you try to enter again, you'll be arrested for trespassing.
Just tell me what you
Have a
just
great
told
day,
me.
ma'am.
What is your policy? Can I deliver this envelope or not?
Ma'am, step back.
Why?
If you step inside the embassy, you'll be charged with
Why won't the
trespassing.
ambassador receive our petition?
Because
of
it's
2,000
security
people?
policy, you will have to mail it. Have a
We
great
have
day.
the letter. It's right here in my hand.
Okay, sorry, I thought Americans liked freedom and democracy.
Be that as it may, when it comes to packages and security protocols, we have protocols that we must follow, and those are inalienable. Sorry, I can't do English this morning. And we're not about violating for any reasons, okay, ma'am?
All right, can I give you a flyer?
Take flyers, ma'am. We don't take any handouts.
So again, that's part of an international campaign alongside local activists in Djibouti for peace to put an end to foreign military bases in Djibouti. There's a website we'll post into the chat where you can find out some more information. Several major military powers have military facilities in quite close proximity to each other in Djibouti. Now we turn to a video from World Beyond War Cameroon. Cameroon takes on gun violence and prepares for the 24-hour peace wave.
We are here today to celebrate the Global Week of Action Against Gun Violence. Youths and women are the most vulnerable when it comes to violence, especially in conflict-affected areas. That is why Women in Alternative Action Cameroon stands together with Cancer to sensitize the population against the use of armed conflicts, against the use of small arms and light weapons, and we say no to gun violence.
Voilà, c'est bon.
Bien, nous, déjà, c'est World Beyond War, c'est un mouvement mondial qui milite pour la fin des guerres, de toutes les guerres. Alors, nous saisissons l'opportunité de la semaine d'action contre les armes légères pour passer ce message de celui de mettre fin à toutes les guerres. Dans notre contexte, nous pouvons le relever, les armes qui sont les plus accessibles sont les armes légères et de petit calibre. Et nous sommes convaincus que nous aurons un monde meilleur, plus paisible, si ces armes n'existaient pas. Donc, il faudrait qu'à l'occasion de cette semaine, nos décideurs prennent la pleine mesure de ce phénomène qui devient de plus dangereux parce que les armes légères de petit calibre circulent abondamment et ce sont ces armes qui sont utilisées pour causer toutes les atrocités que nous vivons dans notre pays, en Afrique. C'est pour ça que nous avons participé à cette activité et nous allons continuer de profiter de cette occasion pour rappeler la nécessité de mettre fin à la circulation de ces armes et par-delà la fin de toutes les guerres. Donc c'est pour ça que nous appelons à l'action à l'occasion de cette semaine. Merci.
Okay.
Ça, Cameroun Action Network on Small Arms Control. C'est le réseau camerounais sur les armes légères de petit calibre. Notre objectif, c'est de sensibiliser la population, les autorités administratives et toute la communauté sur l'importance de lutter contre les armes légères de petit calibre, surtout dans un contexte de conflit comme celui dans lequel nous sommes. Nous savons que si les conflits perdurent, si les violences basées sur les armes sont perpétrées, ce n'est pas par des armes lourdes, ce n'est pas des armes légères de petit calibre. Et ce sont des armes qui sont faciles à trouver, faciles à manipuler. Et quand ces armes sont dans les mains inexpertes, elles causent plus de danger qu'elles ne produisent des effets positifs. C'est pour ça que, à la faveur de la Semaine mondiale d'action contre la violence armée, nous sommes mobilisés en tant que réseau pour informer la population de cette semaine et surtout pour appeler à l'importance de lutter contre la prolifération illicite des armes. Les armes entre les mains inexpertes sont dangereuses. C'est pour ça que Kansa a joint sa voix à la communauté mondiale pour pouvoir commémorer cette semaine.
Ouais, mais vous voyez comment on transpire. On transpire comme un moyen de sensibiliser le public contre les armes légères de petit calibre. Donc, comme vous connaissez, la semaine prochaine, c'est la semaine globale contre les armes, lutte contre les armes légères de petit calibre. Et comme un réseau sur les luttes contre les armes légères de petit calibre, c'est pour ça que nous avons organisé ces marches. Le but exact, c'est de sensibiliser. Vous voyez notre pays, quand vous voyez le nord-ouest, vous voyez le sud-ouest, vous voyez l'extrême nord, vous voyez l'est, et même les rues et les grandes villes de notre pays, vous voyez les armes circulent partout. Donc c'est important de sensibiliser, c'est important de passer la nouvelle que c'est temps pour nous de lutter contre ces armes. Parce que les armes causent toujours les dégâts. Ça cause toujours les dégâts. Donc ça a toujours les conséquences quand les armes sont dans les mains illégales.
Au sortir de cette marche, est-ce que vous êtes satisfait du résultat?
Je suis tellement satisfait parce que on a eu il y avait un monde pour cette marche. Mais en dehors de ça, vous savez qu'il y a plusieurs autres activités à faire. D'ici lundi, nous avons une conférence de presse pour sensibiliser, pour passer les informations, surtout avec les administrations, la société civile et le public en général, sur ce que le Cambisco fait, sur ce que le réseau de lutte contre les armes légères fait en termes de la lutte contre les armes légères de petit calibre au Cameroun. Et juste pour ajouter que le réseau, c'est un réseau de plusieurs organisations qui travaillent contre les armes légères de petit calibre. Quelques organisations phares, c'est la Cameroon Youth and Students Forum for Peace Cambisco, Women International League for Peace and Freedom, Service écuménique pour la paix, Trauma Center, Dynamique mondiale des jeunes. On a plusieurs organisations, mais on est aussi en train de sensibiliser pour que les organisations qui travaillent pour la paix et contre les armes légères puissent devenir membres de Kansa.
Et on va faire un dernier mouvement pour les bras. 1, 2, 3. 1, we go. Stop. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. On ne tape pas.
Voilà.
On last one.
Again. Yes, il faut sauter.
Jump. 1, 2, go.
Can we jump?
Go.
So thank you to all the participants in Cameroon for marching to take on violence and gun violence in particular with small arms. This is very important and it's very inspiring as well to see these actions on the ground as part of the peace wave. Now we are nearing the end of the first of the 12 parts of the peace wave, so we have just a couple minutes left here. Welcome to everyone who is joining in. A very kind welcome from IPB, the International Peace Bureau, and World Beyond War. We're very happy to have you all with us now as we enter hour 3 of the 24-hour peace wave. This event is traveling westward around the world, so we have seen the UK and Ireland and then moved into West Africa. And now we will be moving across the Atlantic and we will be going to South America. Now, if you'll bear with us just for a couple minutes here, Every 2 hours, we restart the recording and restart the stream in order to avoid any limits needed. So we'll take just a couple of minutes before the hour here to get